Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I'll be covering and showing you every official Sega game that found its way onto the Atari VCS, aka the Atari 2600. I'll mostly be referring to it as the 2600. I'll also show you one game that is most definitely not official. We're delving deep into gaming history for this one today, folks, but there's nothing wrong with going back to your roots now and then, right? The Atari 2600 was the first game console we ever had in my family, and if nothing else, it's kind of fun to go back and see how things were in the late 70s and early 80s before the halcyon days of the NES and Sega Master System led to the halcyon days of the Genesis TurboGrafx and SNES, which led to the halcyon days of, well, you get it. Atari's first fully cartridge-based console was powered by a variant of the 6502, much like the TurboGrafx 16, NES, and Commodore 64, among many other platforms and devices. In fact, its 1.19 MHz speed is faster than the variant found in the C64, which ran at just the tiniest smidge over 1 MHz. The 2600 was primitive, with a meager 128 bytes of RAM. That's bytes, not kilobytes. Its resolution was a paltry 160 by 192, but a lot of things were really less than that, since the playfield itself was typically composed of blocks that were 2 pixels wide and 2 pixels tall. Surprisingly, it had a palette of 128 colors, but could only show one color per object. Sprites were also incredibly limited, all the way down to just 2 or 3 depending on pixel width. But hey, this was 1977, people. That's before most of you watching this were even born. You might think the Atari 2600 is even older than me, but if you do, well, you're wrong! Oh, and if you're wondering, there were some sprite duplication techniques where you could put them on different places of the screen, which let it seem like there were more than 2 or 3 on the screen at once. As far as sound goes, the Atari 2600 had a whopping 2 sound channels and could produce tones in 32 different pitches, and it was also capable of producing noise. And what you'll hear in this video is that the sound was not very good, and a lot of games really relied on that noise channel back in the day. As for the games themselves, most came on either 2 or 4 kilobyte, that's kilobyte cartridges early on. The huge games that came out later were a whopping 16 to 32 kilobytes. Welcome to the old days, folks. Most games were controlled with a single button joystick. Some games used the 2-button analog paddles that had a dial on top of them, and there were a few other games that used more specialized controllers too. The Atari 2600 was a huge hit with a total of more than 30 million units sold when all was said and done. Back in the day, while it had some competitors like the prior-released Fairchild Channel F, then the Mattel Intellivision, the Odyssey 2, and the ColecoVision to name a few, the little 2600 that could pretty much whopped all of that competition and was the dominant console gaming force of its era, straight up until the crash of the US game market in 1983. How dominant was it? Its closest competition came from the ColecoVision, which sold 6 million units. The Intellivision was next in line, having sold just about 3 million units. Several of Sega's Golden Age arcade titles made their way onto the Atari 2600, and we'll take a look at all of them today and see how they compare to the arcade originals. I'm only including games that are closely related to Sega, so you won't see stuff like Frogger and Spy Hunter, in which Sega was involved with distribution, but not their creation. With that in mind, if you're wondering, hey, how did the Atari 2600 version of my favorite Sega game turn out? The answer can usually be summed up as this.
Not well.
Let's get on with it. We begin with Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom. If you're a fan of the channel, you've already seen the C64 and MSX versions of this game. You can see the 2600 version is even simpler than those. We'll talk about the arcade version for just a moment. First, it looks almost like a primitive attempt at a superscalar game, and was definitely impressive to see in its day. It had a variety of different stage types, including ones that took place on the ground, in space, and in a trench that wasn't even remotely like the Death Star run from the end of the first Star Wars movie. Nope, not at all. The 2600 version reduces the mission types down to 2. The ones that take place down on the surface where you fly between towers and blast ground-based enemies, and then you take off into space and destroy some enemy fighters. You just keep repeating these 2 missions over and over, and they get a little harder each time. You'll have seen just about everything this game has to offer in about 2 or 3 minutes.
I've seen everything. I've seen it all.
Really, the more difficult loops that come later just throw more enemies at you at a time, especially in the ground missions. This game is fun for a couple of minutes, but not much beyond that. try it if you're curious, but this one is definitely no classic. Next up we have Carnival. Carnival is one of those Sega classics that showed up on several early systems. Picture something like Space Invaders meets Galaxian meets Ducks, and you've pretty much got the idea. You play as the gun in the arcade game, and you have limited ammo, and every time the song finishes a loop, everything gets faster. You have to shoot special icons for more ammo, and take out everything to go on. You can also earn special bonuses for doing things like shooting the letters in the word bonus in the correct order. You even get a bonus round in the arcade game when you get to shoot a bear several times. What more could you want? On the Atari 2600, Carnival is decent. It's scaled back as you'd expect, but most of the essential gameplay remains. They got rid of the music that plays during the arcade version of the game. It doesn't have the bear bonus round either, but overall, this is a fun little early shooter. It won't set your world on fire or anything, but for a few minutes, you'll probably get a little kick out of checking it out before you move on with your life and never play it again. But seriously, this one's worth a go or two. Here's Congo Bongo, Sega's isometric answer to Nintendo's Donkey Kong. The arcade version is really tough and has 4 stages. There's a little cutscene at the beginning and at the end of the 4th stage when you complete a loop. It's a fun early arcade game that looked better than most similar platformers, and the isometric view in this one doesn't even make things too hard to control or judge or anything. Well, at least not most of the time. Now I've got to admit, I've got a bit of a soft spot for Congo Bongo. I find it a little hard to go back and enjoy it today, but I had a lot of fun with this game when me and gaming were both young. There's a lot of weird ports of this game. The Atari 2600 version is one of them. Now it has only 2 stages instead of 4 like the arcade, which was actually very common among a bunch of the home ports of this game, as you've seen in some of my other videos. You'll literally see the entire game in maybe 2 or 3 minutes again. It doesn't control as well as the arcade version, and yeah, the graphics have taken quite the hit, as you can see in Stage 1. Now Stage 2 in the Atari version pretty much ditches the isometric view for a weird faux overhead view, and is similar to the 4th stage of the arcade original. When you finish it, you even get the cutscene of your little safari man burning that big nasty ape. Yeah, take that sweet, sweet revenge. Anyway, your life can remain complete without ever having played Atari 2600 Congo Bongo. If you're curious, give it a look if you want. It's not terrible. There's just very little to it. Here's Deep Scan. It's a Sega classic from way back in 1979. As I record this video in November of 2023, the arcade version of Deep Scan is 44 years old, which is still younger than me. Oh well, time marches on, I guess. This one is really simple, and Sega Saturn fans may recognize it from its inclusion in Die Hard Arcade. Now there's not a whole lot to it. You move your ship left and right, and you have 2 buttons to launch depth charges either to your left or right, and they slowly descend, most likely missing their intended targets. This game is slow. I hated it when I was younger, but I have to say, I actually kind of had fun with it when playing it again here. It'll never be a main go-to for me, but I can understand its charm better now than I did when I was younger. The Atari 2600 version was known as Subscan, and it's pretty similar. It doesn't look as nice, since it's on a chunky low-res screen, and of course in a horizontal display instead of a vertical one. Well, that's true of most games in this video. Also, you only have 1 button, so you can only drop charges in the direction you last move or are moving. Aside from that, it's easy to get the hang of it, and it's okay. This is another one you might want to take a look at if you had fond memories of earning Die Hard Arcade credits. But otherwise, there's not a whole lot to see here. Now we're going to jump all the way to the letter P with Pango, which is another classic early arcade Sega title that fans of the channel will have seen before. The arcade game is tough, kind of fast, and pretty fun once you get the hang of it. Kill all the bad guys, match up the special blocks, do your thing, little penguin. And you do this all while listening to a completely unlicensed version of the song Popcorn. Ah, those early days when companies just skirted copyright laws. Atari 2600 Pango looks much simpler than the arcade version. The gameplay is also easier and more basic. And it's a lot easier than the arcade game. But that may actually mean some of you will like this game better than the original from a gameplay standpoint, since you won't be dying every 3 seconds. But oh boy, the music in this one. Popcorn is gone and we get like a 4-second loop that just plays over and over. And if you don't want to murder someone after listening to this game for 5 minutes straight, you may be a good candidate for sainthood. As much as I love hearing the sound in video games when I play them, for this one I definitely suggest turning the sound off. It's still a good game and worth checking out, but like most of the games in this video, you'll probably have seen enough after playing for just a few minutes. Okay, retro gaming fans, here's Sega's Golden Age vector graphics take on Star Trek, which is called Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator. The arcade original is fun but shallow. It has a fairly gentle difficulty ramp-up and is easy to get to grips with. So after you get in the groove, you'll probably dig playing this for a few minutes, especially if you're a fan of the series. Now, it pales in comparison to things like Atari's Star Wars, which was a much more impressive vector graphics game, but Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator is kinda alright. On the Atari 2600, well, I've gotta say, it's actually surprisingly decent. The C64 version I looked at a little while back was severely cut down from a gameplay standpoint, but this Atari 2600 version is much more robust and has varying level types and a difficulty curve more similar to the arcade game. And in fact, this may just be the best contemporary home port that Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator ever saw. Now even so, it won't occupy you more for like maybe than 10 minutes or so, but I actually kinda like this 2600 version, and it's just way more interesting than the very lackluster C64 port despite its primitive graphics and so-so controls. TAC-SCAN is another Sega vector graphics game that didn't exactly light the charts on fire back in its day. Having said that, it's different enough from most of the other vector graphics games to be interesting and worth taking a look at. You control a small wing of several spaceships and direct them to blast basically everything in sight. Except for some of the extra ships you can sometimes catch to replenish your numbers. You also have a reserve where you can call extra ships in with the touch of another button until your reserve is depleted. There are 3 different stage types, this sort of tilted overhead view to begin with, then a chase view of your ships as they head into what looks like a spinning vortex, and then you have to guide them through a vector-based tunnel. Also, the arcade version uses a rotary controller. On the Atari 2600, TAC-SCAN is woefully nerfed. Now, of course, the vector graphics are gone, but so is about, 80% or so of the gameplay. You control the game with the paddle, so they kinda got that right at least, but the gameplay here is so incredibly simplified. You only have the straight-up overhead stages with color changes. It's missing the chase view vortex scenes, and it's missing the tunnels. Also, the overhead stages are incredibly simplified. Your fleet is reduced to 5 ships as well. This one, I have to say, is really kinda worthless. It's really barely a game. I can't knock it for being bad, because there's practically nothing to it. Hard pass. Okay, on the left, what you're seeing here is Sega's old arcade title, Borderline. It wasn't great. It had some variety with the levels that auto-scrolled vertically, sections where you ran over grass or dug tunnels to destroy these weird reactor things while avoiding fire from jeeps and tanks, and also a maze-like level, and then a main reactor level. It wasn't Sega's best early work, and it was just okay at best. But why am I showing you this game? Well, Sega released an Atari 2600 game called Thunderground. It's similar to the second stage from Borderline, where you drive around the tall grass or dig through dirt or whatever is going on, and you have to destroy reactors up at the top of the screen. Except for Thunderground, that's the only type of level there is. Sometimes there'll only be one reactor visible at a time, and the next one won't show up until you destroy the current one. This isn't exactly compelling stuff, and is kind of another dud that just gets old after a minute or two. So, once again, definite pass. It's not even really worth looking at this game. Now this is more like it. Here's Sega's not-so-classic but still fun arcade driving action game, Up and Down. It adopted an isometric view like Congo Bongo and Zaxxon. You had to drive through roads with different levels of elevation while collecting flags. Collect them all to complete a level. You can jump on and crush other cars as one would in real life. You can roll backwards, but can only jump when moving forwards. You need enough speed to get up steep inclines. And you can also get destroyed by jumping off the road and landing in the scenery. So, like I just said, it's not exactly a classic or anything like that, but I really like this game, especially on the Commodore 64. Now the super blocky Atari 2600 version is kind of fun. It's funny, because looking at this game from a modern lens, the blockiness almost reminds me of the crazy Sega Rally port to the Game Boy Advance. So yeah, this game is ugly on the Atari 2600, and the jaunty music ranges from tolerable to annoying depending on what part of the song happens to be playing at that exact moment. Now overall, Atari 2600 Up and Down is pretty fun, and I spent probably the most time playing this game versus any other game on the system for this video. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that it has quite a lot of issues. The controls aren't the best in this one. Turning to take different paths is kind of tough. It's hard to tell what directions the inclines are moving at times. Enemy cars just randomly stop or occasionally totally vanish. The Atari version is still alright, but it could have really been a fun port despite the downgraded graphics. As it is, it's worth taking a look at. But if you want to play a better version of Up and Down, I just say stick to the C64 game. Sega's Zaxxon was an isometric shooter that was popular during its heyday. It had a lot of action and was crazy fast. And again, fans of the channel will have seen this game a couple of times before, and ports of it to other systems like the C64 and MSX. Arcade Zaxxon had a decent variety of mission types, and the whiz-bang isometric perspective that allowed you to adjust the altitude of your ship was really uncommon at the time of its release. Zaxxon was also famous for being incredibly difficult. This is one of those games where in the arcade, people would often pop a quarter in and die, within 2 seconds of that. But if you did practice, you could definitely get good at it and survive your way through a few loops. Now Zaxxon on the Atari 2600 is a weird one. As you can see, they went with a third-person chase view perspective in this one. You still control the height of your ship, but there's really only about 3 or 4 different stage types. I mean, technically there's really only 2, but there are some variations, like when the electric fences start appearing above the walls, or when you take on the robot Zaxxon himself. Now Atari 2600 Zaxxon isn't too bad, even though the gameplay is a little bit limited. You have your areas where you fly through bases and your areas where you blast ships in space, and well, that's pretty much it. You fight Zaxxon at the end of the second base-type area in each loop. Things do get more interesting when those electric fences start appearing, but in the end, it's another one of those games where you'll have seen it all, within just a few minutes. Now I think 2600 Zaxxon is worth giving a try because of how different it is from the original, so this port really stands out from most of the others that were, available at the time of its release. So, not great, but worth taking a look at. And okay, it's time to break a rule for this series. Let's look at one unofficial aftermarket homebrew game. Zippy the Porcupine. Yeah, this is a take on Sonic the Hedgehog. It's pretty good considering the limitations of the old 2600. I mean, it'll never be anyone's go-to version of Sonic, that's for sure. It pales in comparison to the Genesis version, or even the Master System version. But the developer managed to achieve some interesting things on the platform here. You can check out long play videos for complete playthroughs to see all the levels. But they managed to incorporate loops and even the spin dash, which was of course not present in the original Genesis release of the first Sonic game. Now I have no idea if this is even available to buy anymore. I'm just playing the last free demo of the game that had ever been released. And now I'm gonna jump on my soapbox for a minute here. I'm not gonna hassle the author of this game, or any others. And I don't want anyone watching this video to hassle anybody either. However, I will say that I think anyone that ports another company's game to a system and then sells it and keeps all the profit for themselves isn't exactly on firm moral or legal ground. If you want to port a real game to another platform, great, knock yourself out. Just give it away for free. Don't try and make money off somebody else's work. If you want to charge for making new games for old systems, if they're original, perfectly fine. I do music for new games being released for old systems like the Genesis and Super Nintendo, and yeah, I've gotten paid for it. I've also done some music for hobbyist ports of existing games that will never be sold, and I never took a cent for work on any of those, and I never would. I even dropped out of a port that someone was trying to get permission to do from a copyright holder and couldn't. Anyway, that's enough. I'll get down from my soapbox to close out this video now. So there we are, every Sega game released on the Atari VCS/2600. What conclusions can we draw here? Well, really, these games were ported to an incredibly limited platform, and most of them don't retain the fun of the original arcade games very well, if at all. Most of them are so drastically scaled back, you'll literally have seen everything in the games after about 3 minutes. And I'm not knocking the platform, I understand the limitations. I was alive, I had one of these when they were new, and there are some really good Atari 2600 games out there. But unfortunately, I'd say none of these Sega games were classics on the Atari 2600 platform. Now, Zippy the Porcupine is an interesting modern version of Sonic the Hedgehog, and despite its dubious copyright issues, it's really well made for the hardware. It'd be fun to see modern programmers take on a few more of the old ports and try and do new versions of them that improve on the originals. I'd love to see better versions of Pango, Congo Bongo, Up and Down, and Zaxxon. They all have the potential to be really good on the platform. I'd also like to see what some clever programmers could do with something like Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom today. I would just say to any programmers interested in working on those things, if you're gonna do it, please, don't sell it. Just release it to everybody. Alright, so what did you think of the Sega lineup on the old Atari 2600? Did you love some of these games? Do you knowingly have nostalgia goggles for certain titles? Are they all terrible? Are you seeing any for the first time today? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the channel, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or now through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.